Well, dramatic developments this weekend out of Venezuela. The U.S. launched a surprise military operation that led to the capture of President Nicolás Maduro and his wife. They're now in U.S. custody, and in just a few hours, they'll be arraigned in court on federal charges. President Trump says Venezuela will be run temporarily by the U.S. during a transition, and he's issued a sharp warning to Venezuela's vice president, saying she could, quote, pay a very big price if she doesn't cooperate. To help us understand the legal, historical, and geopolitical stakes of this moment, we're joined by political analyst Anita Manion. Anita, thank you so much for being here. There's a lot to unpack.
There is.
A lot of people are just confused at what even happened and if everything that happened is okay by law, right? So when we first talk about the legal authority for this strike, it really wasn't immediately clear. And reports actually say that it's unknown whether Congress was consulted beforehand. So from a constitutional and international law standpoint, can a U.S. president order an operation like this?
That's a good question, Mercedes, and a question that I think we'll be trying to answer for a time to come. But what the Trump administration is saying, particularly Marco Rubio, is that this was not a military operation. This is a law enforcement operation. So under the FBI and the Department of Justice purview, that they can sort of execute this warrant in a sense. And since it was in a hostile territory, that's why they had to get the military involved. And so I think that would have held more water if the president didn't go on to say that we're going to run Venezuela and, talk about possibly invading Colombia and other places. I think that raised people's concerns. But I will say there is consensus that Maduro was not a good leader, was not a good person, and was not even legally elected. So I don't think that the objections are so much about his removal, but about the way it took place.
Well, and this operation, as we know, involved U.S. airstrikes on Venezuelan air defenses and also special forces basically extracting Maduro from his compound. Right. Now, a lot of people saw this and was like, has anyone ever done this before, right?
Not in the way that we've seen. The most recent and closest example we can talk about is President George H.W. Bush did remove Manuel Noriega and bring him to the United States to stand trial, and he was found guilty. He did serve time. And under that administration, a young man at the time named Bill Barr, who went on to be the Attorney General, wrote a memo basically saying, even if this violates international law, it's okay for a U.S. president to do.
Interesting. Something else that's come up through all of this is the Monroe Doctrine, yes, which is crazy because it's nearly 200 years old, but it's suddenly front and center again. So can you explain why this doctrine is really being invoked now and how it shapes U.S. claims of authority or even influence in Latin America?
Yeah, so this takes us all the way back to the 1830s.
Yeah.
But under President Monroe, he basically said to Europe, stay out of the Americas. This is our territory. Don't try to colonize it. Don't get involved. And we'll stay out of Europe. And then it was expanded by President Teddy Roosevelt and others, and really kind of meant that the U.S. has purview over the Americas, so South America, North America. And then President Trump has further expanded that, sort of calling it the Donroe Doctrine. He always comes up with these names for things. And under that, he's saying that we will have dominance over Latin America. So I think a lot of people are questioning what that expansion might mean.
Well, another thing that grabbed a lot of people's attentions this weekend is what the president said to the vice president of Venezuela. How might this warning affect her ability to govern or even stabilize her country right now?
Yeah, it sounded a lot like you do what we want you to, or you will be removed, or worse, as President Trump said. And so she actually kind of came out with like a more fiery response at first, but now is like, we're cooperating. And so it is interesting. I think a lot of people are debating who should be in power in Venezuela. And the question is, should it be the vice president who's part of Maduro's administration? So if you say it's a corrupt administration, is this the right person to lead? Or should it be the person that many people say rightfully won the election against Maduro? Or, of course, lots of other factions are also challenging for power.
And do you think with all this, given the scale of this initial operation, that the U.S. is preparing for any other military action, or is this more about political pressure and really President Trump trying to control things moving forward?
Yeah, President Trump has indicated that he would be willing to go into Colombia potentially. Obviously, he's made overtures towards Greenland. So there are, international leaders sort of responding to that, saying, we are sovereign nations, you cannot come here. President Trump does tend to use sweeping rhetoric, and so then the question is, what will the actions we take to back up that rhetoric be?
Well, and speaking of that, when the president says that the U.S. will effectively run Venezuela during a transition, what does that mean in practical terms for Venezuela's current leadership, their institutions there, and for its massive oil reserves as well?
That's a big question. And so the president basically indicated that Marco Rubio will, in essence, be running Venezuela for the time being. And he also indicated that a top priority, he didn't really talk about instilling democracy. What he talked about was oil reserves. And so while many Venezuelans are happy to see Maduro gone, there's also concern that the U.S. could come and sort of loot the oil reserves for our own profit.
And in regards to that, when this kind of stuff happens, a lot of people just think, okay, how does this affect me at home? And a lot of times it's, how does this affect my wallet?
Absolutely.
So I know you spoke with Laura Barczewski yesterday, but if people missed that story, how can this impact what we pay at the gas pump right now? Because a lot of people are already struggling with inflation.
Absolutely. And gas prices are not only something that affect us every day, but that we literally see the price advertised as we drive down the street. So we're hyper aware of that. And when it comes to the impact of Venezuela, markets do not like uncertainty. And so the sort of initial response is probably, if anything, slightly higher gas prices. I think we've seen like a 1% increase. But Venezuela actually is a very small part of our fuel, of our oil. And so it wouldn't have a major impact on our gas prices right now. If production could ramp up, really the amount of oil that we've got from Venezuela has dramatically decreased since sanctions President Trump put in 2017. To rebuild their infrastructure and to get them up to producing the amount of oil that was happening before will probably take at least a decade and billions of dollars. And so that's what it would take to really impact gas prices and bring them down.
Okay, that's positive. Thank you so much for this, because there's so much to this. As someone that's consuming maybe just the headlines, it can get really confusing. While we have you here, right at home, another big story we're following, of course, is the sheriff.
Yes.
And today there's a hearing of exactly who can pick the sheriff. What is your take on all of this? What can be decided at this hearing? What do you think the outcome's going to be?
We go from global to local,
right? There's always something.
And so, in a way, the same way the president and Congress are sort of struggling for power over who has that power in international relations, we're sort of seeing the Board of Aldermen and the mayor have a power struggle about who can appoint the sheriff's replacement, who decides when the election's happening, who gets to communicate with the Board of Elections. And so there is definitely a power struggle. It's not so much about, I think, the sheriff's position, because that's not like a super powerful position, right? But it's more so about, where does this power lie? You saw Kara Spencer's letter. There's definitely some tension between her and Board of Aldermen President Megan Green. And even the state has chimed in and said, maybe we have this power, right?
Right, the Attorney General. Yeah, exactly.
And so, and we've seen this struggle between state and local power in policing and in other things. So I think that's really what this case is about. Who has the power, not just for now, but moving forward.
Right. I was going to say that really is the biggest thing, because right now what's done is done almost. So now it's what happens next.
That's right.
Because I also think they don't want what happened with this sheriff to happen again. Repeat history, right?
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much, Anita.
Pleasure to be here.
We appreciate it.